The Premier of Saskatchewan, Scott Moe, is talking. He has a guest with him, the Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford. Both of them have come out very much against the carbon tax plan of the Trudeau government. They are teaming up, hoping other provinces will join as well. Let's listen in.
Overtime win last night would be right here from Saskatoon, the coach of the Toronto Maple Leafs, Mr. Mike Babcock. As we again are assured that all of our Canadian Toronto Maple Leafs fans are hopeful for a Stanley Cup again this year. Ontario, in turn, as it's important for us to acknowledge, Ontario, in turn, exports about $6.7 billion worth of goods and services to our province of Saskatchewan each and every year. Ontario and Saskatchewan most certainly have a significant trading relationship, and we want to strengthen that relationship and thereby strengthen our nation of Canada. Saskatchewan and Ontario both believe in advocating for strong international trade agreements, and I know Premier Ford has worked very hard on this file. We believe in advocating for the ability to transport and to have access for our goods and services in these markets. We believe in advocating for a competitive tax and regulatory environment so that we can expand our industries, expand our jobs, and our opportunities in communities in Ontario, in communities in Saskatchewan, and in communities across Canada. Both provinces want to ensure interprovincial trade barriers continue to come down. Both provinces are committed to pro-growth policies. And of course, we have common ground in our opposition to the federal government's attempted imposition of a carbon tax. Today, Premier Ford and myself welcome the province of Manitoba to this fight. We're pleased to see Premier Brian Pallister has said no to a federal Liberal carbon tax. And it's clear that opposition of this ill-advised, destructive policy is growing across the nation. I want to thank Premier Ford once again for Ontario's decision to intervene in support of Saskatchewan's constitutional reference case against the federal carbon tax. Ontario, as we know, has filed its own constitutional challenge with the Provincial Court of Appeal. And today, I am pleased to announce that the government of Saskatchewan has filed for intervener status in support of Premier Doug Ford's government and in support of all of the people in Ontario in this case.
Thank you.
Saskatchewan and Ontario will continue to be strong allies in the fight against a destructive, made in Ottawa carbon tax that does nothing for our environment and is a direct cost to businesses, to jobs, and to families across this great nation of Canada. With that, I'll turn it over to Premier Ford.
Well, first of all, thank you. Thanks, Premier Moe. I'll tell you, my friends, it's great to be here in Saskatchewan, here in Saskatoon. I love the people here, down-to-earth, hardworking folks. I just want to say that some of the greatest experiences I've had since being elected Premier of Ontario have been working with leaders and premiers in other provinces across Canada. We had some great conversations during the Council of Federation meeting this summer over in New Brunswick. And what I've seen is a real willingness for Canadians from every part of the country to work together. It reminds you what a great country we live in. My friends, Canada is the greatest country in the entire world. But let me say this, in recent days, Ontario has had no better friend than Saskatchewan, and we are so grateful for it. And I couldn't ask for a better partner than Premier Moe. So thank you again, Premier. One of the reasons I'm here, I'm so proud to stand with Premier Moe, is because time and time again, he has proven himself to be a great leader. But not just a great leader here in Saskatchewan, but a national leader. He's a true national leader. Ontario and Saskatchewan have stood shoulder to shoulder in championing free trade talks during these recent negotiations. When the federal government abandoned its responsibility to manage the illegal border crosser problem in Canada and the US border, Premier Moe's government was the first to stand with Ontario in demanding that the federal government takes the responsibility for fixing its own border crossing mess. And it's a real mess right now. And Scott, we worked together at the Council of Federation. As you remember, it took some convincing, but we got every single premier in Canada to agree with our position about border crossers. But the one issue that Ontario and Saskatchewan are most closely aligned on is the fight against the Trudeau Liberal carbon tax. My friends, the carbon tax is the worst possible tax for Canadian economies, the Canadian families. It has nothing to do with the environment. Justin Trudeau wants to make it something about the environment. It does nothing to do with the environment. All it does is take money out of the pockets of hardworking families and businesses, and it uses it to fuel out of control government spending. In Ontario, our first order of business was to scrap the Liberal cap and trade carbon tax. It's gone, it's done. But of course, now in Ottawa, Ottawa has plans to impose a carbon tax of its own. Justin Trudeau, my message to you is this. You either stand with families and businesses and hardworking people across this great province, or you stand with a carbon tax. But I can tell you this, you can't sit on the fence, because when you sit on the fence, you get splinters. But it's not too late to change the way and finally put the people first in this great country. Until then, we're going to use every tool in our toolbox to fight this carbon tax, every single one, including going to the courts. Ontario is proud to join Premier Moe's constitutional challenge of the Trudeau Liberal carbon tax at the Saskatchewan Court of Appeal. And Premier Moe, I'm grateful, very grateful, that Saskatchewan has given notice it will intervene in Ontario's own challenge of the carbon tax in our Court of Appeal. Premier Moe and I know that more and more Canadians are standing up to fight against this job-killing, punishing carbon tax. That includes our friend in Alberta, great friend of Premier Moe's and myself, who we're gonna go pay a little visit tomorrow, is Jason Kenney, who helped lead the fight against the carbon tax in Ottawa and is now leading the fight against the carbon tax in Alberta. And yesterday, I was delighted, I was really delighted that our colleague in Manitoba, Premier Brian Pallister, is joining us and standing up for Canadian families and also saying no to the Justin Trudeau's carbon tax. The facts are clear. The more Canadians learn about the carbon tax, the more they want it gone. We all know there's a big fight ahead of us, but the people deserve to know who's going to fight for them. And I'm so proud to say to the people in Ontario and in Saskatchewan and across this great country that as long as I'm Premier of Ontario, we're going to fight to protect you from this nasty, nasty carbon tax. And in this fight, I could ask for no better partner than Saskatchewan and no better friend than Premier Scott Moe. I want to thank you. And thank you so much.
All right, so we're following this live event in Saskatoon. The premiers of Saskatchewan and Ontario, Scott Moe in Saskatoon and Doug Ford, coming to visit. These two men united in saying they are going to fight the Trudeau government's carbon tax. They're opening it up to questions. Let's just listen into one or two of those.
To accomplish by appearing here in such a unique circumstance, outside of a broader premier's gathering.
Well, I think first and foremost to appear here today is to indicate Saskatchewan's support and our intervening in the reference case in Ontario. Second is to call on the federal government to delay or get rid of the backstop that they're threatening to impose on provinces across the nation. And right now, let's face it, that we're looking at that backstop being imposed on 4 Atlantic provinces that are out of compliance: Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan. Alberta has said they are out of the carbon tax scheme, as well as we see the province of British Columbia that is forgiving a portion of the carbon tax to attract the most recent investment around LNG, which supports the fact that we have always said this is an uncompetitive tax. It's not about the environment, it's about wealth distribution. And so they should delay the backstop, at least delay it until they hear back from the courts. Second, they should commit to providing the infrastructure funding to all of the provinces through the Low Carbon Economy Fund. The previous premier of this province asked the federal government if infrastructure funding was going to be tied to signing on to a carbon tax in this nation. Minister McKenna the day and the Prime Minister had indicated that would not be the case. That doesn't seem to hold true here today with the holding back of the Low Carbon Economy Fund to a number of different provinces across the nation. And last, we would encourage the federal government to restart the relationship with many provinces when they work with them on trade agreements all around the world. And we're more than willing to advocate for free and open trade around the world and across our nation. And you're seeing premiers step forward here today advocating for that. Also advocate for access to those markets, whether it be through transportation or access to our services and goods entering into those markets around the world. And last but not least, we will always advocate for a fair
All right, so we're
regulatory
listening
and
in to
tax
the Premier of
environment in our
Saskatchewan,
industries
Scott
in
Moe,
Ontario,
joined at the
Saskatchewan,
podium at the
across
lectern
nation.
by
When
Doug
Ontario is
Ford of
stronger,
Ontario,
Saskatchewan
two
is
provinces
stronger,
that have come out
Canada
very
is stronger.
strongly against the Trudeau government's federal carbon
You're
tax
sending a very
plan.
clear message.
Manitoba announcing on Wednesday it would join in, and these two men will be traveling to Alberta tomorrow to meet with the leader of the opposition there, Jason Kenney, for the United Conservative Party. He has been a staunch critic of the Trudeau government's federal carbon tax. All of these men saying the tax is unfair to businesses and hurts middle-class Canadians, and they are trying to get a united front on a provincial level to push back against this environmental policy of the Trudeau government. And by the way, going to the courts to do that as well. So it's turning into a real mess for the Prime Minister.